Well, in this first session, week 4, we're asking the question, what does it mean to fulfill? And we've spent a little bit of time on passages in your lesson that talk about fulfillment. And we started in this Matthew 5:17 passage. Jesus says, don't think that I came to abolish the law, right? Remember? Or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. And let me just tell you, there's lots of debate out there as to what is Jesus talking about here. Everybody seems to have a slightly different opinion as to what fulfillment of a law and non-abolishment means. And we can go into other passages, some Pauline passages, some Hebrews passages, and it can just even become more complicated, right? So, not going to try and answer the whole debate tonight, but I'm going to give you my perspective, and just consider it as a perspective that you can maybe add to one that you already have, or maybe adopt it if you think it's good. That'll be your choice. Jesus says, and I think we miss this sometimes, Jesus says, don't think that I came to abolish the law and the prophets. Now, often we reduce that just to the law because that's our concern. Prophets aren't here anymore, right? So we just drop the prophets off and we deal with this statement as Jesus not wanting to abolish the law. But let's consider what it would mean if we kept the prophets in there. Well, first of all, the law from a Jewish standpoint is Torah. It consists of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, okay? We sometimes think of law as maybe reduced all the way down to the 10 Commandments, right? Sometimes we reduce it all the way down. Sometimes we reduce it down to the civil and ceremonial law. But from at least one perspective, the law can refer to the teaching of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The reason I would go maybe that direction is, what do we do with the prophets? Because Jesus said, I didn't come to abolish the prophets. Well, if our perspective is abolishing law, because we have laws in our culture, right? And if we see laws like the laws in our culture, what does it mean to abolish like a traffic law? It means it used to be in place, but now it's no longer in place. It's been removed, right? And so we sometimes think about law that way. But if we're thinking about law that way, we've also got to think about prophets that way. Well, but the prophets aren't here still. They lived in the past, but what do we still have? Prophets, similar to the law being the first 5 books of the Bible, the prophets is also a section of the Old Testament. And so we might be talking about the actual men, the prophets, but we also might be talking about the section of Scripture referred to as the prophets, the law and the prophets. And if that's the case, what does it mean to abolish the prophets? Well, the prophets aren't a law in and of themselves, but what did they bring? They brought a teaching, very similar to the first 5 books of the Old Testament that brought a teaching. And that's often referred to as the law. So, with the prophets, it's not that we're coming to get rid of the people themselves, but Jesus is saying, I did not come to get rid of the prophets, the people themselves. I did not come to, and hear it for what I'm about to say, I did not come to get rid of the teachings that the prophets brought us about what? About who God is and what his solution to the world's problem is. The prophets brought that teaching. And if we think about it that way, we can also think about the law in the same realm. Not necessarily reduced down to a set of rules that we follow or don't follow, right? But if we consider the law to be the whole teaching of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, then Jesus is saying, and possibly saying in this statement, I didn't come to get rid of the teaching that we find about who God is and what his plan is for humanity that we find in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And I didn't come to get rid of the teaching about what the prophets told us about who God is and what his solution to the world is. I'm not here to get rid of that. I'm here to fulfill that. In other words, they were talking about me. They were pointing to something that was to come, and that's me. And in that way, I'm not here to abolish, get rid of their teaching. I'm here to fulfill their teaching. That's a slightly different perspective than if we drop the prophets off altogether and we just say law, and we think of law as rules or commandments to follow. Because then it gets really mucky, and we don't know what to do, and people land in all kinds of places. Should we just follow the 10 Commandments, or only certain parts of the 10 Commandments that were maybe repeated in the New Testament, or should we be following the whole of the law in the Old Testament? Should we be observing a Sabbath day? I mean, that's where this whole discussion comes back to. It's a good discussion to have. Lots of different opinions out there. I've brought you one that I think is worthy of consideration, at least. What is Jesus saying? I didn't come to get rid of what the law or what the prophets taught us about God. I am the one that they both spoke of. I'm the one they were pointing to. And we see this in this last point that I've been talking about, the law and the prophets. We see this illustrated in chapter 11, verse 28 of Matthew. I will give you rest. Jesus is saying that, right? Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy, and another way you could say that is my yoke is comfortable. Okay, or pleasant. It's pleasant. It's a pleasant yoke. It's pleasant to be yoked into Christ's yoke. And I took you in your lesson back to two different places in the Old Testament where similar language, I will give you rest, is used, right? One of them was in Exodus 33, where Moses is having a discussion with God and convincing God to go into the land with them, right? Instead of just sending an angel before them. And in verse 14 of Exodus 33, it says, and he said, my presence shall go with you, and I will give you rest. And then I also took you to 2 Samuel 7, 8 through 13, where Nathan the prophet is having a discussion with David and reminding that there's this promise of I will give you rest from all your enemies, promise from God. And not just that, but a descendant, a seed, literally in the Hebrew, a seed shall come forth from you, and I shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. In some ways, this is fulfilled in Solomon, who built the house, the physical, right? But in some ways, this is how prophecy works in the Old Testament. Sometimes it seems like it's talking about a next of kin like Solomon, but then it explodes and it gets much bigger really quick. Not just establish a house, but also this throne will last forever. That doesn't apply to Solomon, right? And so we understand that there's a bit of prophecy in this as well, that Solomon maybe fulfilled portion of a shadow of that, but Jesus is the answer to that. So it's foreshadowing that. I don't know if you noticed what we just did, though. I took you to two different places, and where were those two places? Where the promise of rest was given by very God himself. The first was in Exodus, which is the law. And then I took you to 2 Samuel, which in and of itself is not necessarily, but who's speaking in the Nathan. It's a prophet. It's a teaching of a prophet that we find in the 2 Samuel 7, 8 through 13. It's the law and the prophets. It's this teaching that Jesus says, I didn't come to abolish this. I came to fulfill it. And when he says, I will give you rest, I guarantee you the Jewish people that knew their Bibles, they all did. It was their culture to know their Bibles. When Jesus said those words, I guarantee you, something popped up in their head like, oh, I've heard this before. And quickly, discussions were starting to follow Jesus about what he said and what he was doing. So what does it mean for Jesus to fulfill? He didn't come to do away with the plan that God had set forth in the Old Testament for the salvation of the world. He didn't come to do away with everything that had been started, the plan that had been laid out. He didn't come to do away with that. He came to be that salvation. That's what he's saying. That's what it means to fulfill. And here we have an interesting statement as we finish. Matthew 11:30, "For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." We had a question on this. Hopefully we had some decent discussion in our groups. The word yoke is very interesting here. So we know that a yoke is that physical structure that ties two animals together, right? And interestingly enough, when there's oxen, usually there's a dominant oxen that carries the majority of the load and leads, and there's a secondary oxen that's not. Otherwise, if you have you pair two dominant, what happens? You don't get much work done because you're fighting against each other, okay? So from an animal husbandry standpoint of dealing with on the farm, putting two together, we know how that works best. We have a dominant that leads, and we have another one that is attached to and pretty much follows, but carries their load, whatever that load is, right? It's not that they're not pulling it all, right? Okay. So it's interesting because we understand that a yoke is a physical structure that ties two animals together, but there's also a sense here that yoke refers to not just that physical thing that ties together, but it's actually talking about the work, what it is that we're to do. The yoke that Jesus offers is a comfortable yoke, is a pleasant yoke. It is a work that is not part of the curse, right? It's a yoke that when you're doing it, it's comfortable and seems natural because it's what you were made to do. And not just that, it's not just what you were made to do, it's not just the work, but it's the method of how you are to do it. So this one word yoke has kind of these two concepts that come together. He doesn't say that the rest he offers is inactivity without responsibility. He says, come yoke yourself to me and do the work alongside me that I have created you to do, is what he is saying. He's giving the people a comfortable and pleasant work to do. It's the work we're created to do. It is both the work and the method of that work that Jesus wraps into one statement. Come be attached to me and do what I created you to do. This is good discussion on fulfillment and Jesus fulfilling that role.